All right. We'll be getting started in just a second here. Good to see everyone. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our little version of In and Out. Unfortunately, no burgers here though. Maybe they got outsourced too. This is an introduction to outsourcing in the games industry. Spoiler alert, there are none in Antarctica. Alright, there might be more puns and more jokes. Sorry about that. I have to have my fun too when making a presentation. But let's get started. My name is Jonathan Murray. Some of you may alternatively know me by my Discord alias, Murmur, or Mur for short, this little polar bear eating a cookie and oftentimes wearing funny profile hats. Whether that be in the Unreal Orlando, GDK, or more popularly, the Art for Games server where I am an active mentor. Here you can see a snippet of my ArtStation and my LinkedIn, but please you can wait on looking me up or following or connecting. These links and the presentation will be made available later on. As you can see, I'm an outsourced artist at Locksha Digital. I've been in the games industry for about a couple years now, and before that, just 2 years ago in spring of 2023, I graduated right here from UCF. I was also formerly a student of this very Games Interactive Media program. As a brief history, my career started right after graduation when I took a freelancing position with Northwood Studios on SCP Secret Laboratory. I was working on props from weapons to SCP items and other environmental props, and later that year I found a second freelance position just a couple months later with another indie team known as HST Studios on their project SCP Fragmented Minds, which recently released its first chapter into early access on the 27th of January this year. But for this talk, we'll be taking a look at and beyond at some of the work that I got to do in 2024 till present, which is Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 and Destiny 2. Two game companies made by wildly different companies. Most of you would likely be familiar with the developer behind Destiny, Bungie, and to fill you in, Asobo Studios is the one for Flight Sim. But I mentioned earlier I don't work for either of these companies. I work for Locksha Digital, which you might have guessed is an outsourcing studio, owned and operated by Keyword Studios, our parent company. Which brings us to the question behind our talk. What is outsourcing the game industry, and whether or not it might interest you to look into it? Also, yes, one of these things is in fact not like the other, being the only bright and blue one and very much action-oriented, not similar to the rest of things around it. So, what is outsourcing? The industry kind, not the geopolitical one. Kinda. With a quick Google search, we can get some solid context as to what outsourcing means to work with. Let's define our term to help frame our conversation. Outsourcing can mean to obtain goods or a service from an outside or foreign supplier, especially in a place of an internal source. Which, while it could work when referring to inside to outside a given company, it more often refers to geopolitical commerce. But our second definition puts it much more succinctly and with a very apt example: to contract, work out, or abroad. You may choose to outsource this function to another company, or to do it yourself. Now I have a few quick examples that we can go into, and we'll scale up into how it directly applies to the game industry, but first we'll start with this little 3D printed goose, who is half banana, or this Dwayne The Rock Johnson Squirtle that Geo owns. So I have this 3D model, and I would love to actually go 3D print it, but I don't have the means. Perhaps I'm too busy, locked out, or so on, so I hire someone, such as yourself, to go and print it for me. I have outsourced the labor of 3D printing it myself, so I am free to go do other things, exchanging money for time, for flexibility. Now let's scale that up. I have a soup recipe. I've made this soup. I really like it. It's good soup. But I have an insatiable hunger for more of this soup. I need more. A lot more. So I hire everyone in this room and give them this recipe, this set of instructions on how to make this soup. And they go out, they make it, they bring it back, and again, I've exchanged money for time, freeing myself up to do whatever I'd like, whether that be working on the next recipe or so on. I've outsourced my soup production. I've also never had pumpkin soup. So now let's talk about games. To avoid any breaches of my NDA, I won't talk about precisely how my company and its clients operate, but one of the inspirations behind this talk was a GDC talk done by Maxime and Lenart of Guerrilla Games on Horizon Forbidden West, where they detailed how they went about designing their robotic dinos and outsourced the labor for scaling the production of them. To summarize some of their talk to our topic at hand, After hiring Mike Nash, who is a freelance concept artist who had recently passed away, so may he rest in peace, because I've been a longtime fan and his work has been very inspiring to me. He was hired on to help finalize the look of the dinos in the first place. And Gorilla operated on a subjective slash objective basis regarding their work. So in this photo, you can see that they have outlined their production pipeline. They go from concept to detail to outsourcing and texturing with a review process in between. But then they overlay this by showing how the concept, detail, and texturing portion are a lot more subjective. They are engaged with the creative license and the direction and the vision of their game and how they want things to look and feel and impact the player experience. Meanwhile, stuff like game mesh, UV maps, and LOD creations are considered to be objective details. So all these rigid operations, again making the game mesh and these sorts of things, were made by outsourced vendors. What this allowed them to do was drastically shorten their production time by scaling their output to outsourced vendors. And this is very much the way of how outsourcing operates, even from my own experience. A company internally designs something, figuring out the what, how, and why they want to make it, and make it the way they want to. Then they can create an instruction set detailing the process, much like a Lego set allows you to reproduce the same thing from the same set of pieces, and give it to an outsourcing vendor to then follow through on those instructions and produce more content for the game with just some oversight required. You can see how they were expecting to take 24 years in development of the game if they had to do every single dino internally and back to back, and now they're able to hop and skip their artists across different things to review different dinosaurs and go focus on working on the next section of the game and the next thing they want to design and envision on, and then have the rest of it be done by outsourcing studios, in which case they then bring it back, do final touches, and then integrate it into the game. Now, it's not to say that concepting and texturing are outside of the outsourcing industry. It naturally becomes down to a particular game and cases, such as, again, Mike Nash, who had originally done the concepting for the dinos, was a freelance illustrator. So he was outsourced directly as an expert in the field to go and do that thing because they had researched him and really loved his style and wanted to see what he could do with their ideas. And in the same way, some texturing might be done with outsourced companies as well, whether that be like material setup, or if they have a defined, say, making skin systems for Valorant, or for something like Population 1, that stuff can be done by outsourced vendors because they just detail the sort of polygon and texture limits, and they have the concept, and they've outlined the process of the weapon pipeline or whatever they might have, and they simply want an outsourcing service to go act on it. Now, while I am an artist by trade, and thus that is the primary focus of my knowledge base, there's a whole host of job types both in the games industry directly and indirectly associated with it. The following categories that you're going to see on screen are what keywords the parent company of my own categorizes their services as and the companies that fall underneath them. We have game development, we have QA testing, player engagement and data analytics in there, globalization and localization, music and post-sound, art services, marketing, audio development, and accessibility. All of these and more are different ways in which outsourcing happens in the game industry, whether or not people are brought directly from the game industry, having worked on games in the past or something to make more things just for different projects, or people from outside the games industry that come in to provide support work either for some of these categories because they're subject matter experts. Maybe it's writing support or consultation or anything like that to make sure that they can achieve the outreach or the result that they think they want. So now that we understand what outsourcing is and so now that we understand what outsourcing is, as we know the why, who is doing it? Who are the vendors laying bricks for some of the largest games out there? Perhaps not the ones doing the internal design and visionary concepting, but the companies that largely facilitate those dreams. The skills you guys learn here, and thus a potential foothold doing the work you'd want to do as a production artist, programmer, and so on. Well, we have some pretty good examples to take a look at from large-scale projects that were nominated, or in the case of Astrobot, won the 2024 Game Awards. Moby Games, a website, does a great job archiving these titles, particularly their credit lists. I've gone through and I've gathered the list of the outsourced companies who supported these titles, so we can take a look at them here today. And naturally, minus Balatro, the indie title. First up is our winner Astrobot, supported by Virtuos and Velen Studios for additional art. Oh yeah, and all of Sony, who owns their entire ecosystem of support teams. While useful, because Sony has this, so they have their own debug teams and creative arts and game analytics and operation services and engineering and everything else you can imagine, things that generally a company would go and seek in the outsourcing industry. Sony has their own dedicated team for their sponsored projects, and it's a little makes it a little not applicable per- to our conversation. So let's take a look at what's next in line. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Whew, man, that is one hell of a wall of text. But taking the time to look at your favorite games in this way can build a sense of what companies work for these companies, what they do in terms of the type of outsourcing work they do, and sometimes what is geographically local. And if you would happen to look at that, these highlights are actually studios owned by Keyword Studios, the same parent company of the one that I work for, Loxia Digital. And we also happen to have one of our branches work on this game as well. Black Myth Wukong, less intense but vastly centralized. However, we have the slight inclusion of keywords. So this becomes another example, and we'll have some more where we actually go into a map around my company in particular and maybe how we developed a relationship with Bungie. But while international releases and titles will certainly hire international companies, especially if they're trying to get their game to outreach elsewhere, and that has to be translated and localized and so on. Um, a lot of times the direct companies that help support the assets made for the game might even be local to that region. It might be down the street. It might be maybe another city over. But the idea is some things are hard to communicate due to language barriers. We also experience this with our own company, where Loxia Digital is an India company. But we have a branch in Europe, and we have a branch in the US, and we have a branch in Asia. Um, and we still have that struggle ourselves where getting details across in terms of the precise way something has to be done, or reviewing something and critiquing and making sure that that's understood so they know precisely what they need to do to then take the feedback and incorporate the changes that were requested by the client and so on. It can be difficult. You kind of got to spell everything out precisely the way that you need it, and even then sometimes stuff can still be misinterpreted. But if you don't have those language barriers, if you're able to just to naturally say what you need and have it be more easily understood, it certainly helps cut down on any potential miscommunication issues that then slow down the development process as a whole. So we'll get more into the sort of distribution of work that exists sometimes between in-house studios and outsourcing companies, but it is something to keep in mind that you could potentially just work down the street and maybe have an inn somewhere. Metaphor, even smaller, but also fairly localized. And sometimes, and oftentimes, many Eastern titles have a lot more outsourcing support in the arena of globalization to make their games reach the audiences they want. And that was also worked on by Keywords directly. Actually, to go back for a second, sometimes when you see this where it just says Keyword Studios and not any other studio, generally means localization or globalization, because Keywords, having owned all these other companies, does a lot more of like HR work type support things, while a lot of these smaller companies will be more dedicated to like programming or porting or additional art asset development and that sort of thing. Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree, whatever arguments you may have as to whether or not it deserved a nomination because it's actually a DLC for a pre-existing game and not a whole entire game released by itself, but also a very diverse cast and coloring of studios, and we see the inclusion of Keywords and Loxia Digital still. So, FromSoft, once again, Asian company, you might have a lot of other things in here that appear that do additional art and support development for the game that might be more up the alley of what you want to do. So, that is a very important thing that I want to cover in terms of, because as we covered with the Guerrilla Games example, an in-house studio will be much more preoccupied with the design and the vision of the game. You will less likely see in some instances roles at that company that cover what we would probably consider to be the grunt work, the junior levels, the mid levels, the people that go out and do that objective work of making the low polys, making the laws, optimizing UVs, doing all of that very structured content development. Instead, that gets largely sent to outsourcing studios to free up the true designers of the game to go work on what they want. In which case, yeah, you're going to see a lot of companies in which you're largely seeing senior and upper level management and principal artists, the people that are developing the workflows, doing the important high level, like high poly design work for some of the art, or they're managing the writing of the game or the design of systems and structures, or they're doing programming stuff. A lot of that lower tier work exists in outsourcing. And so that's where you see junior levels and mid level positions maybe more often than not. Um, and so working at these companies can help you actually take the skill set that you learn directly here in the major and see more opportunities in the experiences that you're looking for where your skill set can more apply and make you more competitive in that area. And you can also take that experience farther, such as like where I'm today as a mid-level at this company, where I do a lot more review work than that type of direct production work. Um, and maybe it's located across the street. Maybe it helps you make connections at that company by being a liaison, working between them to talk to people on the other side, so you can go meet an art director or you can go meet coworkers there and interface with them. So potentially, if you have a dream company you want to work for, maybe you can't work for them directly, but maybe you can work alongside them and help bridge your way in. Now, the map that I showcased earlier is created by a group known as GC Insider. Their map shows all known game companies, this map behind me that you can see on the screen now that's a bit unblurred, that all known game companies to them and the area in which they exist. And so as you would zoom into this map, these bubbles will decrease and break away into smaller bubbles and the numbers will be more scattered, but you can click on them and then see the list of game companies that are located in that region, even in the exact city. If we zoom into the northwest of America, we can take a look on my little base of operations, though I do work remotely and thus I still live here in Orlando. But just outside Bellevue, in Washington, we have Bungie and us, Loxia Digital. Our friendly little example on how sometimes outsourcing companies can sometimes be within the locale of the studio itself. Unfortunately, their website, GC Insider's website, gamecompanies.com, is still under development compared to their app functionality, but I'd like to highlight the usefulness of their technology. My company is listed as a art and services company, which is true, but we can use their tags to filter their database, thus allowing us to see other service providers, these being outsourcing companies. Admittedly, even from themselves, it's a work in progress resource, but something is better than nothing when it comes to a helpful tool to delineate between in-house and outsourcing studios should you wish to try and find more of the latter and find out about them and have a direct link to the website to it. Trust me, like I was trying to find some resource that I feel like would largely benefit you guys, but when you plug game companies, even outsource companies or outsourcing in the game industry and that sort of thing into Google and you're just doing a broad keyword search, you're naturally going to have the more popular, the more widely commented search engine optimizations for these in-house studios appearing because, of course, if you go to Steam, you're going to see the publisher and the developer. But unfortunately, you can really only find the outsourcing studios in the credits unless you get a little bit more fancy and creative. So this is something that I definitely recommend you guys kind of take a look at because it's a pretty neat thing to see what's out there around the world or around the companies that you want to be at. So, how is outsourcing? An anecdotal and personal perspective from yours truly. So first and foremost, I always provided hardware by my company. Most companies probably would do this due to licensing, which is different from the world of freelance, where you're typically expected to do things yourself, bring your own tech, your own computer, your own licenses, that sort of thing. Someone who doesn't like managing multiple devices, such as I have three, including my own personal PC, but I really only need to use two at the moment, which also extends to peripherals, might be irritated by this, like having to have multiple monitors and wire everything up. Um, but yes, companies that you're working under will usually provide you the tools necessary to do your job to some extent or provide some support as well if you needed to get an additional thing, especially when they have to make sure that you're using what the client is using. Just to kind of go into that briefly, the way my company operates, we have to use whatever tools the client uses. It's kind of our policy for keeping parity with them, and that can get wild very, very fast. I'll leave the rest of that for later. So, outsourcing is also more likely able to provide a remote capacity for work than in-house, which has more needs to maintain protection of like their IPs and their tools. Bungie, at least I know, is kind of one notable exception to this. I don't really know how far it extends in the company, but a lot of people that I get to work with are also allowed to work remotely, so they get more cozier experiences for themselves. But granted, remote work is also kind of a consideration for you to have yourself. If you prefer a more in-person and personable environment where you can like, be next to your coworkers and reach out and talk to them, go out to lunch together or that sort of thing, you can more easily facilitate relationships in that way. Then yeah, remote work can kind of be lonely. It can kind of feel like a prison in other ways, but there's certainly a lot of things you can do to kind of make your remote life a little cozier, do what you want, make your own setup, do chores that you want to do on the side. But I can certainly understand the reasons and why people would want to pursue office work. Um, I did actually kind of already talk about hardware when I was prattling on, but uh, for balance, it is generally expected for projects, particularly those with constantly short turnaround times, that work time is synced between companies or within the company itself. For instance, I work a later shift of sorts. I generally work like 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And this makes me more in line with my coworkers on the West Coast, where the office is located. Laksha previously was more of an in-house studio entirely, or in terms of being an on-site location workplace. But during COVID, they started opening up a lot more remote opportunities, and then they just kind of kept going with it. So my company currently offers a bit of flexibility in this, but only by about a few hour difference at max. Mostly for the sake of like the primary meeting blocks in a day you gotta have and be able to show up to. But someone that wants a particularly strict schedule or kind of knows the time block that they operate best in might find comfort here or might prefer something that's more local in their time zone. Just some additional considerations. My goal is to kind of like realistically lay this out for you guys. Additionally, while layoffs still occur within the games industry, I found outsourcing companies to at least suffer a little bit less. Yes, my company itself has suffered directly, but at least I've personally not seen or experienced more than maybe uh, a half dozen or so. Generally speaking, when a project has concluded, there's no reason to just remove you. You just get shifted to another project, should that there be uh, the capacity needed for you to do so, and there largely is, as these companies have like continual work cycles in their department from multiple clients that they're just kind of bringing out and then bringing more in. Um, Especially depending on the way that area or that company works. Usually there's kind of one of two things that happen in the outsource company, maybe even both at the same company, where people will hire an outsourcing company to work with only a few heads for a set amount of hours every day on their project, or maybe even a few days a week, where you're kind of hopping and skipping between multiple clients and their time blocks that they've requested. Where on the other hand, you have like the full more larger studios that want a dedicated team of X amount of heads, 8 hours a day each, 40 hours a week. So that is more like a long-term constant ordeal versus the more juggling experience. I have had a little bit of experience in both. When I first started, I was in that sort of strike team working on three things at per day in a way. And then Flight Sim was, more rigidly structured, as you might expect from a Microsoft game. Um, but yeah, and then overtime for myself was optional. While it is technically crunch and outsourcing kind of has that reputation of getting a bunch of stuff put on them and then them having to deal with it. The way my company operated, I was allowed to do it voluntarily, so I wasn't required to. They would have to work things out and deal with it if simply wasn't possible. But I wanted to. I appreciate the additional pay. I love the camaraderie of my team during that time. For my own experience, it's certainly not an exception, quite rare. Even on Bungie right now, the expectation is that if such an event were to occur, it was kind of a failure of upper management because no one wants to waste time or money. Like, we should be ahead of the game on these things. People should be able to take time off, and we've budgeted the time to make sure everything can be handled well, or we can pivot stuff between team members. Um, as long as everything's going at the expected efficiency rate, things are golden. Now, work variety, the last thing. Wearing many hats. If you're being on multiple projects, chances are you're doing a bunch of different things. You might not be doing the exact same type of work or the same type of asset or even reviewing it in my case. So, yes, outsource artists, again, we heard it earlier, I'm an outsource artist for Loxia Digital, but internally, I might be called a final reviewer. I might be called a 3D artist, like my credit on Microsoft Flight Sim. I might be a hard surface artist, or an icon artist, or an integration artist. There's a lot of different hats, and naturally these words mean a lot of different things. If we expand this to the type of software that I use, yeah, I used Unreal on HST Studios for Fragmented Minds, and I used Unity for my time on Secret Lab because I was making assets for those types of game engines. But then we get into modeling software where we have Maya and Blender and 3ds Max and Simplygon. Marmoset Toolbag, we have Painter, we have Photoshop and Illustrator by technicality. We have VS Code where I had to do like some packaging and programming work for some projects. We have Flight Simulator's proprietary stuff. We have Bungie's proprietary stuff. Like a dozen, if not more, than stuff that I'm probably even not familiar with yet still that we have to use. So between different projects, there's different work to be done. There's different hats to wear. It can get pretty crazy, but personally, I really enjoy this. Like, this is what I've come to really appreciate about my job is I get to go learn all of these different things. I get to learn these tools. I get to read the documentation of the different projects that I'm working on. Um, but for someone that kind of wants a more simplified or straightforward structure of working on a game for say 3 to 4 years before it's released, and they kind of stay in their lane as a character artist or a prop artist or environment, or maybe however wide that lane might be with different types of things you might work on that in that umbrella, it's not would certainly not be nearly as diverse as this. But for someone that kind of wants to be hands-on and wants the variety of all that sort of stuff, then outsourcing might make more sense in that case because it's just kind of something new every day. Things are a little bit fresh. You can uh, bounce around. So certainly something to mention there. So I also wanted to provide resources for you guys. This is kind of as we're winding down. Um, when I graduated, I had a couple indie positions pretty soon after graduating that I was doing as a freelancer. So they certainly weren't like, you know, the greatest economic choice ever, but I was able to make connections and get a lot of experience relatively quickly and put stuff in my portfolio relatively quickly. I didn't have an internship when I was a student, something that I kind of regret and wish some people did, or that I like chased after. Um, but to bring you on kind of my journey, I utilize LinkedIn, and I certainly recommend everyone does so here. I'm pretty sure it's part of your curriculum for your portfolio development classes of making that professional social media page for you to go out and make connections with other people, even people that could be in this room. Like I had someone on my workshop team when I was in school that happened to be working for Northwood as a VFX artist, and so having some conversation with them, I was like, "Hey, yeah, send them your information. Let's see what they think." So that's where that all started at the very least. There's also another one called Hitmarker, a little bit more kind of gamery in a way, but allows you, they have some really good sorting tools for their services, so you can kind of hunt down specific companies and how that stuff kind of works. Remote Game Jobs, if it interests you, is a portal for remote game job only roles type thing to help you sort things down. GameJobs.work is just another random thing that I still have coming into my inbox that kind of tells me like, hey, here's some opportunities that were posted today for like me to review and then click on and see the links of. And then, like I said before, the map that was used for this presentation is from Game Companies, their GC Insider Plus app. So you can go zoom into where things are located and what's around the area. You can go sort for particular types of service companies and so on. But above all, if anyone watched the Game Awards, you might have seen this guy give a little presentation. His name is Amir Sadvat, with the website amirsadvat.com. And his website has a lot of really, really great resources from resume and cover letter writing and interview prep and getting critiques and getting eyes on your stuff, so that people can help you out and polish things up and kind of put your best foot forward sort of thing. But the biggest thing that helped me is I had about like an 8 month dry spell between when I was starting with HST and I was getting some interviews, but just nothing was really hitting until in December of 2023 when I had Locked Digital reach out along with High Voltage Studios from Keywords, and that I got hired and I started in January. Was this resource where he has a Dropbox Excel sheet that is just a massive web scraper. So you can look at categories of companies. So this is like the art, tech, animation, cinematics, and video one. And it goes on the internet and all of the known companies that are in this sheet, it has a link directly to their website, their application portals where you can go look at the roles available, but at least gives you the number of what roles are available. And they also do it by whether or not it's remote or hybrid or in person only. And so I would just spend some time and I'd type out like maybe 100 a day, just trying to like do submissions of click the top 20 companies under a certain category and then go click every job type that was relevant to me and just start filling it out. Send out as many as possible because maybe you'll get a few hits. So we covered what outsourcing is in terms of why companies do it, They have objective work that's more grunt level. It's just kind of it's busy work. It has to get done, and they can't really move on to other things that is more design and direction and vision of their game until it is. So they simply do a few proofs of concept and package it up and give it to an outsourcing company to make and develop the rest while they can go do their thing. We've talked about what some of the companies are that do this work and where you can find more of them. If you have any particular ideas of working for a particular company, and maybe you can find out some outsourcing studios that often support their games or a game that you really like, and maybe it's a company that actually did the production work for it, the ones that were actually making the models or the characters. Or the textures, and you can actually go work at the company that is doing that work that you were learning in this major to do. And maybe you can scale yourself up into that dream studio that you want to be at, or simply just enjoy the variety of what you want to explore for your skill set. And we've talked about my own personal experience where I try to kind of break things down into a realistic viewpoint of some pros and cons and some different perspectives that I can imagine based on what people might want to enjoy. And that's it. This has been an introduction to outsourcing the game industry. So, thank you. Any questions at all? I try to keep it light as a subject. I was talking a bit earlier that you can get into the weeds very quickly doing how companies operate across the pond, the type of work that they're able to do. Yeah. So, we go over stuff. But for you personally, what would you say like the process and also what's the okay. But I think the best aspect, just to get it out of the way, was I like seeing everything. I loved learning in school different techniques and ways to do things for modeling. I like to continue to explore rather than just buckle down to one particular thing and really knock it out. It is important in terms of like trying to not wear so many hats. You know, I want to be a VFX artist and a character artist and a prop artist. Kind of have like one lane to stick into, but then you can be surprised at how wide that lane can be. So as an outsource artist, when I get to work on about 5 different projects in total throughout the year, Flight Attendant Destiny being the larger two, I got to read all this documentation. I got to be exposed to their software and their way of doing things. I just loved learning that, the behind the scenes of how it all works and getting to be a part of it myself. The worst aspect that I've probably ever had in my experience so far. 3ds Max. Yeah. So that there will be a sort of abrasion that you can have between what the client is demanding and what is required of you for your work. That could be software in terms of having to use either an old piece of software or a particular kind of software or a tool that maybe wasn't made well. That can be frustrating. Or in some cases, it can be communication just not going the way that you want, whether that be internally to the people doing work that then you're reviewing, if that is my job, or if you are getting it sent to someone and then someone gives you feedback and you go action on it, and then they're like, actually, this other thing instead. And then you go action on it again. And they go, actually, do it again. And you're like, okay. It can be frustrating in a lot of different ways. But I have always been someone that kind of just laughs it off. Like I've had weird experiences where last week I had something of a particular method that I followed that was documented on go review this thing. This is how you plug it into the system. This is where you go open it up, and then you go check it. So I was doing that for a week, and then the next week, that was removed. I went to go open it up, and I hopped into the engine and went, where the hell is it? And I had to reach out to someone for them to tell me where they moved it to, and the new way to get to it, and the new debugging tools they had, when it wasn't really communicating in the first place. Again, the more people involved, the more hand in the cookie pot, so to speak, where you have your own team to communicate with, your own coworkers, your own leads, but then they also, whatever liaison they have from the client, and then whatever their workers, whatever context communication portals you have with them. It can be a lot of learning to speak with people and make sure you can get the information you need. What made you like want to do outsourcing compared to like something? I think from my own experience, when I was a student, I was not someone much with lofty ambition. Not to say that they can't exist. Like if you have a studio that you really want to work for one day, you take step by step by step to try to either develop your skill set or your portfolio to really mirror the art style or the direction of a particular company, and then ideally try to get to them one day. I just I enjoyed playing games. I enjoyed learning how they're made. So I was okay with trying to pursue an opportunity anywhere. And when I had watched that BC talk, which kind of was one of the first fundamental inspirations I had of the people that can just be involved in the making of it, can be not at that company, but just at the companies that they hire. And if I go to work at that company and I get to work on this title for 6 months, and I get to go work on this title for like 3 months, or this one for 9, there might be a chance that I end up working on marathon one day. I just get to be a part of all of it. And for my skill set of not having an internship as a student, to kind of learning in my senior year that I was a little bit behind and that I had a lot to cover because of what professors I had and what classes, and trying to make sure that I actually learned the skills needed to be competitive in the market, try to pursue a job. Outsourcing ended up being more in line with what I was looking for when I was looking at the field and just seeing like LinkedIn post after LinkedIn post after LinkedIn post of in-house studios, and it's only like senior level roles and management roles.
So for those who don't know, Professor Morrison here.
Yeah.
I worked at my own outsourced studio, Blind Squirrel Games. Murray and I have talked about this a lot and seeing your journey. It's like, oh yeah, no, I remember that. I remember that too. I do have to ask, like, did you know of Laksha Digital before you found it on like a website, and how did you find that? Because I had no clue that Blind Squirrel existed until I applied.
A big part of what I was doing with all the resources that I had mentioned of sorting through and searching for different opportunities available, I believe I found Laksha through LinkedIn. Just, hey, they have this 3D artist position, or I think it was originally titled like a hard service artist that I applied to. I'm like, I have the skill set. I think I have the experience that they're looking for. I'll try my best. But this was a part of me sending out as many applications as I could daily and just hoping for something to come into my inbox later on. That December, after having sent out a lot of stuff and sort of finally getting a couple of calls from High Voltage, which is also Keyword Studio, which is hilarious, and Locked Digital, talking to their interviewers, initially over the phone, like their recruiters who work for keywords. They don't actually work with the companies directly, because again, keywords kind of, at least for the companies they own, do a lot of HR stuff for them. So I had 2 calls with 2 recruiters that were sitting across from each other in the office on their end, just being like, we want you to one of these 2 companies, maybe we'll make it a competition, but ideally, even if it doesn't work out, we have all these other companies that we could just send your information to, and maybe something comes through. High Voltage I had heard about, Lost Digital I had not, but then just to touch on, to take the opportunity to touch on another point about connections, when I was scheduled to do an interview with that company, with their actual technical team, I do what I generally recommend people do in general. If you see the email come through for your interview and you see people assigned to that email, the other people you'll be interviewing with, go look them up. You might have questions you want to ask that you should write down for yourself. You might discover, in the case that I did, that one of the leads who was a part of my interview knew Hunter, Nicholas Hunter, the professor here. And even though I figured it out in the interview that they actually went to FIA together, it was at least a touchstone of, I can relate to this person, I can tell them about my experience, it's someone that he had a positive relationship in the past with, so I become a little bit more trustworthy. And even though I was never recommended the interview spot in the first place, I didn't have a connection that led me to Laksha. Connection still ended up mattering because people knew people in the past, and people know people where they currently are in the industry or within the company itself. So things can matter. Every little point helps. So
You mentioned like many.
Yeah.
I kind of read a little more generalist. There are a lot of like triple A's.
Yeah.
Would you say that's specifically like a product that your company operates, or just general outsourcing? You're probably expected to be a little more general.
Oddly enough, in my experience at the company, especially since I kind of started off in a mid-level role versus a junior, which they also did have. Like, it was a junior hard service artist position at High Voltage. But then there was this position. I didn't want to move to go live in Colorado for that role, so I wanted to choose the remote one. But most of the stuff that I've learned as a student, I don't generally do for my work, for my job now, but it's information and knowledge that I reference almost daily and connecting concepts to learn new ones. I think if you work in outsourcing, wearing many hats is generally inevitable. Unless you are hired on for a project long term where they have like a long-standing partnership with that company. Maybe you work on that project for a year or 2 years. You just kind of have like some additional tools that you add to your workflow. But generally speaking, you're sticking in the same lane for a long time, maybe working on the same general type of assets for a while. But with outsourcing, particularly with outsourcing houses that generally seek multiple clients, you might be moved between teams or you might be working on multiple projects at the same time. In which case, it might not be the same role for every project. It might not be the same type of asset that you're doing for every project. Or if you're doing production work for them, they might require you to use one software or another. Generally speaking, for in-house studios, they on the 3D modeling side of things, they're becoming more open to just you being able to use whatever tool you want, at least for the creation of stuff. Animation's a whole different story where you're kind of locked into a program once that happens. Yeah.
If you're done, I can speak to that.
I got a little bit more.
Yeah.
But the way my company operates is we are required to use whatever our client uses. So that is not only for the software in general, like if they do their modeling in Maya, we do our modeling in Maya. It's if they do their modeling in Maya 2022, we do our modeling for them in Maya 2022. But if this other client uses Maya 2023, we also have Maya 2023 on our computers. So there's a lot of like odd redundancies in some ways, but it's just like the client relationship that you have with your company might require you to use multiple softwares across different projects. The type of work that you do across those projects, like the different names that I've had for the projects I've worked on so far will be different. But my experience so far has been multiple projects. There are some other things I know at my company where they're just character artists that might be working on a game for 2 years because the client is large enough that they want that extra dedicated team. But it'll be few and far between.
In my own experience, so I was a gameplay animator with specific I won't say focus, but I had motion capture under my tool belt. Like my many hats that I wore was motion capture animation, creature animation, a little bit of rigging, some sort of pipeline work. The more you do one thing, you'll learn more. So I would assume with hard surface modeling, you learn more texturing, go along.
Yeah.
But when I got hired at Blind Squirrel, they saw that I had one tool that is very hard to get your hands on the knowledge for. It's Motion Builder. And the project that they were using needed Motion Builder people, so they snatched me. The next project I worked on was still motion capture, did not use Motion Builder, so I had to figure it out in the way. And they had their own weirdo proprietary tools because it was an MMO and Lumberyard and nobody uses them.
Yeah.
But throughout the process, they were paying me to learn new tools such as speech graphics for procedural facial animation, as well as like the sequencer and UE and all these other rigging type things. They needed people to do that on the project. It's just something that happens. If you're there and you finished your work, okay, the client needs it done.
Yep. That also reminds me, for the way my company operates, I work in our hard surface department. So because of my skill set, there's only certain things that they will apply myself to, and they also track the self-reported skills of every employee. So if you are familiar with certain technologies, or if you have done particular type of work in the past, like I was predominantly a weapons artist, that is where my focus largely was for learning the hard surface side of Destiny. But I also do like some graphic design work and icon work. I'll probably say the largest like 2 umbrellas for hard surface art is like weapons and vehicles. And so they were very curious if I had done vehicles for putting me on flight sim, but then it was just like, you have enough hard surface experience in weapons that maybe it's still applicable. But if they have people that have a more fine-tuned skill set for the project in question, they move those people first, and then you can have other people that may have analogous skill sets, but then they can train you up on it. Even for Destiny, we had people that, like, for icon work, sure, 3D artists might know Photoshop or something, but how often has they used it? When was the last time they used it? Do they know certain aspects of the program, like actions and that sort of thing? And that might not have been the case, in which case they just took someone that was on the team and said, you go learn this now. You're now our expert. It's like a subtle promotion in a way. So we have, like, one of my coworkers was just someone that shares my job title, but was just, you're going to go learn icons now, and suddenly you're being pulled into meetings with Bungie art directors to explain things to them. And he's like, how? I just had to do it. A bit of a far cry from the work that he did originally. My lead before he got put on, or my former lead for Flight Sim, was originally a character artist that was doing work for Dauntless and some other stylized games. And then he was moved to be like, hey, you're responsible. We want you to lead this project. He's like, that sounds great. Because another lead was leaving, and they got put on Flight Sim for like 4 years. Just hard surface, mechanical planes, but with originally a character artist. I would say that's probably much more rare, but it's still, if a role needs to be filled and they have someone that's available, skill set might not always be entirely applicable, and they just require you to go learn something else. Any other questions? Yeah.
Then working house. You work on a lot of house. I know, like, I said, like, some people work on one spec. They work on a lot of variety. Yeah. I know you enjoy working at a house, but, like, say you suddenly want to go work at a big house. For a lot of these projects, a lot of them end up being worth putting on paper. It's not like really, like, let's say you do like 5 the whole year, maybe like 5 of them are honestly done without actually add to it.
I would say they're almost always worthwhile to put on your resume, especially if you work like a substantial amount of time on the project, which I would say like at least a few months. Yep.
Can you put them on your resume?
That is a good point. In some cases, you cannot. If they're unreleased. If they are unreleased titles, you largely cannot still, because they're just not known by the public. Whereas one that I was introduced to at the start of my time at Lockshaw, I got to work on it for like 8 months before I got moved to Flight Sim because there was a request for help there. I can't talk about it. And it's annoying to me because they've also never said anything to the public. The company only talks about themselves and the people they've hired, and they've never said a single thing about the game they've been developing this entire time for like 2 years. They haven't mentioned the genre, they haven't mentioned the art style, they haven't mentioned the name, nothing. It's infuriating.
I will let everyone know that one of the first games I worked on Blind Squirrel, the one that it's like, hey, you know Motion Builder, this project's on fire, that's fire extinguisher, go at it.
Yep.
I was convinced for a full year and a half that it would never come out. And then I was watching like the Game Awards or something, and I hear something I heard for a full 6 months. I'm like, oh, wait, what? That exists now? I can talk about it.
Yeah. Documentation might vary between companies. Always make sure you look at your legal documentation like NDAs. But we'll say, generally speaking, for games that are released, your name would probably be in the credits. Your name is in the credits, and yeah, they can go on your LinkedIn. And on your LinkedIn, you can also do subheadings. Like if I worked at Lockshaw Digital as an house artist, I can say projects that I worked on inside of it. It will actually nest them. So that's a nice way to be like, oh, I got to work on this release, or I spent some time on this project. And so you can also kind of rapidly accumulate a lot of things that you've done versus working on one company for a game for 4 years, and then you have one release after working in a company for 4 years, where depending on how things go in my future, I might have had 3 releases, and maybe spent like a couple times on some ongoing games. But it's variety is spice of life.
The way I did it, again, when I thought my game was, and I was behind stuff, I just had Blind Squirrel Games and all the stuff I did while at Blind Squirrel, rather than on Delta Force, on New World. It's just how you present it on your resume.
Which is also kind of ties into the way that you're credited. So
For Flight Sim, I was a final reviewer, but that name doesn't really not well known in the industry. So the way that we were credited in the game was 3D artist instead. 3D artist is my skill set and knowledge base. So that's what would go under my LinkedIn. Like, hey, I worked as a 3D artist during my time at Lockshow on Flight Sim, and I covered this skill set. Versus whatever internal name you're called, which might sometimes be more confusing because it's whatever policy or conventions that company has. Yeah.
Talking about credit, so there's been a thing in the game industry for a bit where it would be, and like, hey, we're using this keyword studio, but not including. Have you encountered
So far, I have not. For what I've seen and how my company operates, whenever there is a release, there is an email that gets sent to you saying, hey, we need to get everyone's name that worked on the thing and send it across. And that includes from every department of the company, to then what your name is, what the role you would like to be called is, and then they also send like a double check for you to review the information. Because we had someone who's like, was on Flight Sim, was their first time as a senior 3D artist. He was like, I need to make sure that it says senior because I'm like 20 years in, I'm a senior. Yeah, I've not had any time where it was like just the company itself. Usually they're scrolling through on the credits page or something.
it? Just happens.
Yeah.
So.
That word that happened. Yeah. So
You just depends on like the NDA you signed. The conventional wisdom is once it's out there, it's out there.
Yeah.
If you did it and it's on your portfolio, you can say, but it's harder to confirm that. So it's a weird aspect.
Yeah, and there would be a case for like being able to show your homework in a way. Like if the game's been released and you're allowed to put it on your resume, if you're allowed to show your work in a portfolio, for you to be able to be like during an interview, hey, I've seen you work on this game, but you're not in the credits. What did you do? But you can actually back it up with, I made this, this is how I did it. Like depending on what you're still allowed to talk about at that point. Is easier to kind of prove that you did it rather than like making something up and becoming seen as untrustworthy or something.